Thanks for having me here this morning. Usually I'm talking to scientists, so it's much more fun to get to be here talking to you all. I think the title that they gave me was something along the lines of mental health and prevention. And candidly, I thought that sounded really boring and something that I wasn't even sure I'd want to sit and listen to for 45 minutes. So actually, what we're going to talk about, you can see I switched it up here a little bit. And what we're going to talk about today is a lot more about you all, about where you are in your life and thinking about what you want to do with it. But before we get to that, I want to tell you a little bit about me, because if I have to sit and listen to someone for 45 minutes or so, I want to know something about who they are and where they're coming from. So I'm a professor and I'm a researcher, and really what that means is that I went to college and had so much fun that I never left. In fact, when I was at UVA as an undergrad and I told my dad, who's a military general, that I was going to go on to graduate school, he said to me, "Are you going to be one of those people that stays in school forever and never gets a real job?" And now we actually laugh that I have stayed in school for forever. I just turned it into a real job. So there's something to be said for working with your parents on that one. The other reason I love being a researcher is because I love discovering new things. So I was always that kid who was asking why. Why do fireflies light up? Why do some people get sick? Why do I have a curfew of midnight? I drove my parents crazy with all the whys. Some of you perhaps can relate to these kind of things. And right now, when you're at school, your teachers are teaching you a lot of things, but hopefully they're also instilling in you a love of trying to understand what are the things we don't know? What are the next questions? And when you're a researcher, you get to spend your life figuring out what are those interesting questions and how are we going to answer them. I find brains and behavior fascinating. So how I ended up in this world is that I was pre-med at UVA, I think like everyone else who starts there. And I took a psychology class, and I became fascinated by the idea of as the brain of the last frontier of medicine. We know so much less about the brain and behavior and what happens when something goes wrong than we do about other areas of medicine. And that's what led me to change my career path and go on to do a PhD and end up working in this area. So now I get to address questions like, why are some people more likely to develop depression after something bad happens to them? Or why can some people bounce back from adversity, but others essentially kind of curl up into themselves and become more anxious? Why can some people drink socially and other people it takes over their lives? These are the kinds of questions that I study now. Things like, what was this guy thinking, right? Brains and behavior, I'm telling you, it's fascinating. The last thing that you need to know about me is that the reason that I do this is because I actually care about making a difference. And lots of you all probably feel this way as you're trying to figure out what you want to do with your lives too. I wanted to do something that was more than just 9 to 5, making money. I wanted to do something where I felt like I enjoyed it, it was interesting, and that it was making the world a better place. And part of how I ended up getting so interested in this area was when I was taking this psychology class, and then when I worked on a psychiatric unit, I was blown away by how many people were affected by substance use and mental health challenges. And by that, I mean anything from depression, ADHD, anxiety, substance use disorders, autism, more severe challenges like bipolar disorder, schizophrenia. Tell you what, raise your hand if you have known anybody who's been affected by one of these kind of outcomes. Could be a family member, could be a friend that you've worried about, could be a neighbor or one of your parents' friends. Look around. It's all of us, right? All of us are affected by these things, whether it's personally or just with people that we care about or interact with in our lives. So it turns out that 1 in 4 individuals over the age of 18, 1 in 4, is affected by a psychiatric or substance use disorder, one of these kind of challenges. And it turns out that adolescence to young adulthood, so the phase of life that you all are in, is actually a high-risk time for the onset of lots of these challenges. This is when, in all these transitions of life, a number of these things start to show up. And so one of the things that blows me away is, why aren't we talking about it more? And so that's one of the things that I try and do, and why I'm probably partly here today, is because together we can do something about this. Together we can change this, and we can bring down this 1 in 4 individuals who are affected with one of these challenges. So what I specifically study is, what do we know about adolescent alcohol use? So what influences it? What causes some people to use more than others? And what causes some people to develop problems? So that's what I'm going to talk a little bit about today. Now, the first thing is that you might have, from the laundry list of different departments that I work with and different areas that I've trained in, which range from developmental and clinical psychology to basic biology and molecular genetics, you cannot understand behavior without starting with the brain. You can't understand behavior or what people are doing without understanding something about the brain. So that's where I'm going to start. It turns out that brains develop tremendously from the time you're a little kid until the time you are, I'm going to ask, does anyone know when scientists now think brains are fully developed, that all those connections? 25, okay, clearly somebody has told you all this before, because there are way too many people who know. Does anybody know who figured out first that brains stop developing at about 25? Okay, lots of thoughts out there. Turns out it wasn't scientists, it was car insurance companies. How old do you have to be to rent a car? Not 16, not even 21, 25. And it's because they had all this data on car crashes, and they'd figured out, ooh, everything doesn't work really well to make all these complicated decisions until age 25. So now we know, and we can map out brain development. This is why little babies can not do things that toddlers can do, that little kids can do, that you all can do. And the phase of life that you all are in right now is actually when your brains are changing tremendously. So there's all kinds of connections that are happening. And the part of the brain that develops first in adolescence, the part that works really well, is the part that responds to reward, right? This is why you guys get a bad reputation for doing lots of risky things, because they're fun, right? And your brains right now are wired so that those things are really rewarding. That part of your brain works really well, and that's why you see lots of risky behaviors in adolescence that parents like me worry about. And it makes sense from an evolutionary perspective, because historically, thousands of years ago, what you all would have had to do at this age is leave home and venture out and not get eaten by animals and find a mate and all those kind of things, which take a lot of risk-taking. But the last part of the brain to come online is the part of your brain that tells you what the consequences of actions are going to be. That's the part of the brain that is not fully developed yet for you guys. So things are really fun. Your brains work really well in that respect. But thinking through, if I decide to sneak out of the house tonight and go to this party with my friends, might be really fun now. Your brain gets that. But what are all the long-term implications of that with your parents, with your schoolwork, with maybe your grades, where you get to go to college, what you then get to do with your life, all those kind of things. Your brains don't actually work as well. So when your parents say, "What were you thinking?" you can tell them, "I was thinking, my brain is just still under construction," okay? Now, Let me clarify. That is not an excuse, because now all of you know this, which means you actually just have to try extra hard. And you have to make it routine that when you think, this sounds like a great idea, this sounds really fun, you have to force yourself to think through, okay, let me think about what all the consequences of this are going to be. Because your brains, what makes you get better at things? Practice, right? You want to be a good violin player? You have to practice. You want to be good at sports? You have to practice. You want to be good at making good choices and figuring things out? You have to practice. So it turns out that that's part of the reason that adolescence, there's so many things going on in this phase of your life, is because your brains are changing so much, and these parts of your brains are not yet fully developed. So you really need to work extra hard at that part. And here's the other unfortunate bit. Because your brains are undergoing so much right now, so much growth, so many connections to turn into adult brains, it also means that adolescent brains are more affected by alcohol. And I added the caveat, and I don't mean that in a good way. What I mean by that is that, so what we know is that when you're an adolescent and you drink, that you are less sensitive to the motor incoordination and the sedative effects. So it means it takes more alcohol. You're less likely to stumble and to slur your words, and you're less likely to fall asleep earlier. And for some of you, those things might sound like they're good, but it turns out that actually the reason our bodies respond that way is it's a defense mechanism. Because if you drink too much, it can kill you. It is a sedative. It slows down your organs. It slows down your breathing until it stops. So these things kick in. Things like stumbling and slurring your speech, they kick in to tell your body to shut it down. So you can't drink too much before you kill yourself. It turns out that adolescent brains, those defense mechanisms are not all in place yet. And the other thing, the unfortunate bit, is that adolescent brains are also more sensitive to the harmful effects of alcohol on learning and memory. So when you drink in moderation as an adult, your body has these things that kick in, slurring, stumbling, getting sleepy and going to sleep, that can protect you. And alcohol use in moderation doesn't appear to have any long-term effects on your ability to learn new things or remember things. But in adolescence, it actually does. So because your brains right now are getting wired, that alcohol will actually change their ability to reach their potential. And it can have long-term consequences on learning and memory. So that's the unfortunate thing, and these are part of the reasons that alcohol is illegal when you're younger, because we know that it can be more harmful. It turns out that when you start drinking earlier too, one of the things that we know is you're much more likely to develop problems. And so what this is showing is, sorry, I'm a scientist, I have to have some charts and data in here, but this is a big project. It's 40,000 individuals from all across the United States that have been studied. And they asked people, at what age did you start drinking? Okay, so this is dividing people up into, I started drinking at 13 or younger, 14, 15, 16, et cetera, all the way up here to 21, where it's legal. And then they looked at what percentage of them actually developed problems with their drinking. And you can see that when you're younger here and you start drinking earlier, you're much more likely to develop problems, as opposed to those folks who wait until it's legal, and then only about 10%, which is about the population rate, go on to develop problems. So it's pretty striking. It turns out we can further split this up as to whether folks have a family history of alcohol problems too. So we know that about 20% of adults overall are affected and have some problems with alcohol. And when you divide folks into whether or not somebody in their family also had a problem with alcohol, Look at this. Those folks who start, the people who have a family history are in blue here, and the people who don't have a family history in red. So for everybody, the trend is that when you start drinking earlier, you're more likely to develop problems. But if you also have somebody in your family that struggled, then more than half of these people are developing problems. So it turns out we're not all equally at risk. This is the whole life's not fair bit. We are all at risk for something, but we're all at risk for different things. Some of us are going to be more likely to develop cancer than others, and some of us are more likely to develop substance use problems or challenges with depression or anxiety. Because all of these outcomes, virtually every behavior that we have studied that's a complex behavior, is a product of our genes and our environments. Both of these things and how they come together. And alcohol use and problems, and depression and anxiety and all these other things, are no different. So it turns out that alcohol use and problems are about 50% heritable. So about 50% of the differences between how much people drink and whether they're going to develop problems is due to differences in all of our genetic makeups. And the other really interesting thing is that this changes a ton across adolescence. And so, if you'll bear with me for another bar chart here, this is data from one of my studies, and we were looking at how important are genes in blue, what's the heritability, so I talked about it's overall about 50%, but how does that change across development? Is it genes or is it the environment, shown here in red, that's the most important thing in how much folks are drinking? And what you can see is earlier on, environment plays a big role. Because presumably, if you were drinking in adolescence, you were getting it from somewhere, because it's illegal, right? So you're getting it from a friend, from a parent's cabinet, from knowing others in your school or in your neighborhood. So a lot of it is environment early on. And remember, because your brains are in that reward, fun, let's do things that are a little bit risky, it's natural to have a desire to try new and different things. So whether or not people try it tends to be a lot environmental. Do you have access to it? But here's what happens. Once you try it and you start drinking, then genes become far more important than the environment. So your biology starts to take over and influence how much people are drinking and whether you're likely to go on to develop problems. So early on, it might be environmental and kind of also a product of adolescent brains that are thinking, let's try fun things. But then once you do start drinking, your biology starts to become really important. So, sitting here right now, wouldn't it be great if we could all know how at risk we are, right? If you could know how at risk you are right now, then presumably that could help you make smart decisions so your life doesn't get derailed. Well, it turns out we actually can. And I don't need your genotypes to do that because we know a lot about what the predisposition to developing problems looks like. And only part of it is how our bodies actually respond to alcohol. Another big part of it is through our predispositions. So I'm going to pause here for 1 second, and we're going to take a detour and talk about marshmallows, okay? So bear with me. You get to not listen to me for a moment and actually listen to something else.
Okay, sit in that chair. All right, here's the deal. Marshmallow for you. You can either wait, and I'll give you another one if you wait, or you can eat it now. When I come back, I'll give you another one, so then you'll have two. But stay in here and stay in the chair till I come back, okay? All right. I'm gonna go do something and then I'll come back.
It smells yummy. It smells really good.
All right, so it's up to you. You can have it now or you can wait. Okay? I'll be back. Stay in the chair, okay? Okay. All right, so I'm gonna leave and then I'll come back, okay? So you can either eat it right now or you can wait. Either way, okay? Okay. How'd you do? Did you do good? You did? Yeah. You wanted to eat it, didn't you? Yeah. So did I tell you to give you another one? Okay, now you can have both. You need them.
Okay, so I want to know, how many of you all would have been the Eat the Marshmallow Kids? How many of you all think you could have waited, held out for marshmallow number 2? Okay, lots of hold out. So it turns out this was an experiment done by psychologists in the early 60s and 70s, and it works like a charm. You can continue to repeat it to this day. And what they did is they essentially followed these kids and looked at, kids vary a ton in how impulsive they are, right? How much they wanted that now. I love the little girl who doesn't even wait until she leaves the room. She's like, I got this, I'm good. And they followed them across time, and what they found is that those early differences were related to all kinds of differences later in life, too. Because we have genetic predispositions toward temperaments that influence our lives starting very young. So we actually did a big study following a huge cohort of about 15,000 kids over in England that their mothers were reporting from the time they were pregnant on, and then once they had babies, they were reporting on what their little kids were like. And we could actually predict who was going to be a heavy adolescent alcohol user based on the kids' temperaments from their mom's reports before age 5. So predispositions show up very early on. By the way, I love, these are how things show up in the press, right? And here's the long, boring scientific study that actually originally came out. So, let's take an example here. What kind of things would you predict about the personality of this child? I hear some risk-taking, impulsive, here's some mischievous. Okay, so it turns out this is actually my child. And from the time he was little, he's now 10, but I spend my days trying to convince him not to jump out of the top of these very tall trees. But fast forward a decade, and I am guaranteed to be trying to convince him that beer bongs lead to nothing good, right? Now, maybe some of you all can identify with that child, but maybe others of you identify more with this child. Okay, what do you think that this little boy is like? A little shyer? I hear a little more anxious, maybe, more introverted. So, neither of these things are in and of themselves a bad thing, right? Being a risk takers tend to be more entrepreneurial. They're not afraid to start up and try new things. Those can be really good things. On the other hand, having a little bit of anxiety, that's a good thing, right? Anxiety serves a purpose at certain levels. So there are lots of different dimensions that we all differ on. A few key ones that kids, and really all of us, differ on are impulsivity. So how much do we like trying things that are new or different, even if they're maybe a little bit dangerous? Let's take this one for a more present day example for you all who probably spend less time in trees now. I would enjoy the sensation of skiing very fast down a mountain. Okay, think for a second about where you would fall. Not too long. Okay, raise your hand if you would be a disagree strongly on this one. Okay, raise your hand if you would be a disagree a little. Hands down. Raise your hand if you agree a little. Hands down. Raise your hand if you agree strongly. Okay, so if you all looked around, you would notice you guys fell across that whole spectrum, right? There's people across all of those different areas, and you're skewed a little more highly toward the agree. Remember what I told you about brains, right? Where your brains are? Adolescents and young adults overall tend to be a little bit more sensation-seeking. When I do this with adults, they're almost exactly split across the 4 areas. When you do it with adolescents and with my college kids, they're split across all 4, but they're skewed toward agreeing more, because that's where your brains are. Okay, so we differ a ton across that dimension. Other key ways that we differ on are things that, as scientists, we might call emotional reactivity. And what that means is how strongly you feel emotions in response to things. So another key dimension here is executive function, okay? What that really means is how good are you at thinking through the consequences of your actions, right? Do you want things right now, or do you think about what the long-term implications are? And we all differ across all of these things. It turns out that folks who are higher on impulsivity are more likely to drink heavily and to potentially develop problems. And that's because, again, these are not bad things in and of themselves, being sensation-seeking, liking reward, liking to try new things, but when you spill that outlet into trying alcohol or other drugs, you're much more likely to develop problems, particularly if you try it when you're younger and your brains are still developing. Emotional reactivity. Folks who tend to be highly emotionally reactive, some of us just experience things more strongly than others. We get more anxious or more worried about things. And those folks are also, they're more at risk for depression and anxiety, but also more at risk for developing substance use problems. And it's a totally different mechanism than up here, but it's more of a drinking to cope or to escape from things. So if you don't learn effective strategies like mindfulness and meditation and ways to help manage some of this, if you're one of those types, then sometimes people slip into ineffective coping mechanisms like being more introverted and drinking alone and those sorts of things. In addition, if you have trouble thinking through the consequences of your action, then, I'm sorry, this arrow is definitely not going through that. If you're higher on executive function, then you have a lower risk of developing problems, right? So, if you are not as good at thinking through the consequences of your actions, then that can lead to a higher risk. When you're good at it, then you're better at thinking, oh, this might not be a great idea. Turns out that where we fall on these things is genetically predisposed. A big part of our predisposition to developing substance use problems or depression or anxiety, it is in these temperamental styles that we all have and that we're born with. But the key thing to remember here is that our dispositions aren't our destiny, okay? So we might be predisposed toward different things, but that's the great thing about behavioral outcomes, right? We're not destined to turn into our parents or to develop problems, even if we're at risk. And as a scientist, I think that ultimately knowledge is power. So if you take a minute and think, where do I fall on those different dimensions? Am I the sensation seeker? Am I someone who's more prone to anxiety or to worry? Am I somebody who's really good at being conscientious and thinking things through? Or am I sometimes thinking like, oh God, what was I thinking? You know yourself better than anybody else. And so that means you also can know how at risk you are. And then you can make decisions accordingly. Because if we return to my mischievous, high-risk-taking child, he comes by it honestly, right? His dad, my brother are all fighter pilots. Who do you think becomes a fighter pilot? High risk takers, right? He has inherited that disposition. But they have also all found ways to channel that disposition into productive, different outlets, right? As one of my close friends who has a really high risk-taking teenager said, he does all kinds of extreme sports. And another parent said, don't you worry about him? And she said, I can fix a broken arm. I can't fix a broken brain. I'd rather he have those outlets. Find other outlets if you are a high sensation seeker than getting into things like alcohol or drugs. I run this big project that was mentioned earlier at VCU. It's called Spit for Science. And what we do is we have created a university-wide research opportunity for all of our incoming students. We've had about 70% of all of our students participate for the 4 years that we've run this project. So we have almost 10,000 students that we're following. And what we do is we ask them to fill out surveys about themselves. So what do you like when you show up at college? And then we follow them up every spring thereafter. How are you doing as you're going through your college years? And we also ask them to give a DNA sample. Spit, hence the spit in Spit for Science. Because we talk a lot about how substance use and mental health outcomes are a product of our genes and our environments. And if we want to understand what contributes to them, we have to understand both of these pieces to the puzzle. In addition, we have lots of undergrads that are part of our research team. And maybe one day you all can come join us and be a part of that as well. And so they get to come up with the ideas for the things that we want to test and explore about what contributes to some of these outcomes. Because honestly, they're so prevalent, they affect all of us. But it's only by all of us working together that we can also figure them out and we can make a difference. So the research institute that I run at VCU is called COBE, short for College Behavioral and Emotional Health Institute. And you can go to the website here and you can follow us on Facebook or on Instagram or on Twitter. And what we do is I've hired a former VCU student. I was so impressed by a project that I saw in one of his classes that we hired him to come on. And he does all the digital media for COBE. And what we're trying to do is get the things that us scientists study out into your hands, into the hands of everybody, so that we can have this information and so we can all make a difference in our own lives and in the lives of the people that we care about. And so you can learn more here, and we would love for you to come be a part. So really, what I hope you will remember, if you remember anything from me being up here today, take-home messages. 1, know your brains, know where they are. There's lots of amazing things going on at this phase in your life, so you also don't want to mess it up. Know your disposition. You know yourselves, and now you know a little bit of something about what kind of things that might put you at risk for. And you can think about what are other ways that you can channel those dispositions, or you can reach out for help. And the last thing that we can all do is talk about it, right? Historically, there's been a lot of stigma surrounding substance use and mental health challenges. And that's absolutely ridiculous, because what we know about the underlying biology is that they work just like all the other major biomedical outcomes. They're no different than cardiovascular disease and cancers and everything else. They're partly our predispositions, they're partly our environments. And so together, we can all work on making a difference and tackling these things. So with that, I thank you for your time. I hope that you will visit our COBE website if you're interested in these kind of topics. And if some of you come to VCU, I hope that you will participate in Spit for Science and maybe come join us in helping discover some of these things together. Thanks.